And I just want to start, I'm joining you from Auckland in New Zealand tonight, but because I am an Australian, I would really like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people and pay respect to their elders past and present. I'd also like to extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. And I wanted to wish everyone a very happy Night Elk Week. Really exciting events happening in Australia this week for Night Elk Week. So my talk today, or what I really wanted to talk about today, is actually my experiences in actually building capability within, I've heard earlier today. So there's so much, there's absolutely reasons why we need to make sure that we provide accessible digital assets. And I really felt like Sarah and Andrew gave some really great examples of some great ways to approach that and how to ensure that you consider accessibility from the outset, so from the very beginning, and it's embedded into all IT delivery processes. But what I really want to talk about is actually, so how do you make that work in a really complicated, complex corporate that's already there? How do you suddenly start delivering accessible assets for your customers? So the way that I want to talk about that is to tell you a little bit about my journey in the accessibility space. So I fell into accessibility about 4.5 years ago when I accepted a role at a really big corporate in Australia, in Melbourne. And part of my role there was digital accessibility. And I didn't know anything about digital accessibility at that time. I had a hunch that it had something to do with the disability community and technology, but I hadn't ever used a screen reader, heard a screen reader, or even thought about how people with mobility impairments may be using technology. So I had a consulting background, so I did what all good consultants do. I started with doing some background research and making sure I really understood what this digital accessibility space was. But also I started with a plan, and I sketched out my very ambitious plan, and I decided that I would have everything sorted and built, as in a structure and an approach built within 6 months. Thankfully, the Intopia team I was working with at the time very politely advised me that perhaps my plan was a tad ambitious and I would need to reevaluate those timeframes. And look, they were absolutely correct. And I really want to talk about some of the things that I've done over the last 4 or so years within that corporate environment to try and save the next people that are doing this task, maybe shave off 6 months or so off that timeline to make some real change. So I think the first big challenges that I really ran into within that corporate environment was funding. So I would have these great conversations with stakeholders and they'd really say, yeah, this is exactly, absolutely, I get it. This is something that I'd like to do, but you need to pay for it. And so when you go into a large organisation, funding is really, really critical, and projects are often divvied up into different groups and the funding is extremely tight. So suddenly coming in and saying that this project that it needed to make sure it had an accessible product at the end of it was actually quite a substantial ask, and that was a big barrier. The next challenge was that accessibility was very much viewed as my problem or my responsibility, and that came from the fact that I was leading accessibility within that organisation and that my stakeholders didn't actually know how to tackle it. So I was one person in an organisation of hundreds of thousands of people, which is really not enough. And then the third really big challenge that I had thrown at me from my stakeholders was around timing. So I got a lot of, that's really great, but our budget's already set, or that's really great, but we're about to deliver. So it always seemed to be the wrong timing. I was never quite engaging them at the right time. So I won't lie, I was actually really taken aback by the attitudes of the stakeholders within the organisation, and I couldn't understand why they weren't just with me on this, why they wouldn't just allocate some money, they wouldn't just make some time. And I think I was being a little bit naive and a tad unrealistic. So what I did is I thought about my approach, and I really pivoted the way that I started to talk to these stakeholders, but I actually changed my plans quite substantially to look at really what the systemic process issues that were standing in my way and that were really leading to my stakeholders to really push back to me in those areas, because it wasn't actually that they were bad people or careless people. It was more that they had a job to deliver and expectations that didn't include digital accessibility. And what I was asking for was an add-on. So I guess the biggest barriers line up to those challenges. So you won't be surprised that those barriers around funding structure, and this can be a really big barrier in a corporate context, a corporate space, and also smaller organisations too. The next was around capability. So there isn't a lot of in-house digital accessibility capability within large corporates at the moment, because accessibility as a technical skill set is still quite a niche skill. So that's a really big challenge for big and small companies. And then the other really big systemic challenge is top-down leadership in the digital accessibility space. So what we had was that we were really IT driven from an accessibility perspective, but we didn't have that same message coming down from our top leaders. And a lot of the time, again, it's not for a lack of care, it's about priorities and what that leader is trying to drive through their organisation. But it's a really big challenge when you're trying to roll out digital accessibility if your leadership team isn't talking about it and isn't making it a priority. So I'm going to now just cover off, I've got 6 areas that I want to talk through to talk about some of the things that you can do to work around those barriers, and some of the practical things that you can do to help you to deliver inclusive experiences. So the first one is all around the IT planning process. So because a good portion of your key roles for delivering inclusive experiences are typical IT roles, so business analysts, front-end designers and testers, it's really important that within the IT funding process, you have the ability to include accessibility within scope of those roles and of that portion of your project. So one of the things that I did initially was I sat in on all of the IT planning meetings to get and request funding. And I basically said, if you have a user interface, your product is going to need to be accessible. How are you going to do that? And then I would start to work with those teams to plan that out. And then over time, we were actually able to add in, I called it a stage gate, but essentially it's just a tick box for any project manager that's trying to get IT funding. They basically have to tick the box to say they've engaged the digital accessibility team to ensure that they've got the right scope for digital accessibility. And so that meant that projects were actually thinking about accessibility at the right point. Like Sarah and Andrew said, it really needs to be at the very beginning. And so when they're planning and they're trying to get money, let's make sure that that accessibility conversation's happening. Now, I've just realised I haven't mentioned a really important thing, which was that we had in the organisation that I was working in a really strong digital accessibility policy, and this is what helped me to do all these things. And it's sort of a key enabler to doing anything in the digital accessibility space in an organisation. So our policy existed before I joined the organisation. I think Sarah actually may have written it if I remember correctly anyway.
No, actually Mike.
It was a really good policy.
Mike wrote it.
Was it Mike? Was it Mike?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah, Mike wrote it.
It was a great policy. And the reason it was a great policy is because it included not just assets that were customer facing, it also included assets that were team member facing and supplier facing. And when I say asset, that's just the word we used for a digital product. So like an app or a website or an application that you might use, like even just Outlook is considered an asset that needs to be accessible. So that policy really underpinned all of the work that I then went on to do. And it helped me to have that harsh conversation at the funding point to say, look, we have a policy to follow it and help you. Area is all around procurement. So in a large organisation, you'll find that you don't tend to deliver all your digital products on your own. You often work with different partners from many different organisations. And from an accessibility perspective, that actually means they need to deliver an inclusive or an accessible product. And if you don't have the conversation with those partners at the right time to go back retro accessibility. So what we did in the procurement space is we started to attend our request for proposal meetings, which are very boring, sorry everyone, meetings where all your different vendors bid for work and they run through their presentation. They're very technical IT meetings. But what we did in those meetings is we made sure that our suppliers that wanted to work with us understood what our policy was. And we asked them quite detailed questions about how they were going to deliver to that policy, because a lot said, yeah, I know what you're talking about. But then again, referring to Sarah and Andrew, they were just checkboxing. They weren't actually thinking about usability. They had no intentions to engage people with disabilities. They'd never engaged people with disabilities before. They just thought they would get an audit done at the end and that would be enough. So initially I had all those conversations with vendors at the request for proposal stage, but eventually what we did is we created accessibility questions as standard in all of our RFP documents with our vendors. We also had contract clauses drawn up with accessibility commitments within them. And most recently, we worked on an accessibility risk assessment. So all of our vendors, when they start to work with us as an organisation, we actually have a viewpoint of their risk from an accessibility perspective, and we can use that information to determine whether we'd like to work with that vendor over another vendor. I'm keeping an eye on time. I'm going to whiz through. So budget allocation won't surprise anyone. You do need a little bit of money in the accessibility space if you're going to roll it out in a corporate environment. It helps to use companies like Intopia to come in and bring in really specific technical expertise to help to train your teams, and you do need budget for that. So I do encourage you to seek to get your own budget outside of the project delivery budgets. Education is key, and I think this is where I had the most barriers in my journey, or I guess I had the most learnings. It's that the way that I initially approached accessibility conversations wasn't really, I mean, I was really well intentioned, but it just didn't work very well. So I started with, you know, the policy and the fact that companies get sued, but actually everyone just felt I was a little bit negative and difficult to work with. So I had to adjust that and think about, okay, well, maybe I'll start talking to them about the people behind this. So how many people, what's the size of the prize, you know, show them the dollars, show them the money, that'll get them interested. And it kind of did, but didn't really work. So then the next step that I moved towards was really around empathy. So I used the microadaptive video to really get my stakeholders understand that everybody getting the opportunity to participate. And I think the words they use is when everybody plays, everybody wins, or something like that. And I absolutely stand by that. And then we're still evolving those messages. So you have to change your messages frequently for accessibility. And now I'm really focusing on co-design with people with lived experience of disability. So I'm shifting the conversation again. Training is also really key. And you need to think about the right training method for the maturity or the stage that your organisation is at. So initially we used classroom-based training because we had a really low knowledge base, and that helped a lot of people start to really accurately understand what digital accessibility was. We then moved into a one-on-one mentoring style training to help those key roles to gain the required skills that they were going to need. And then now we're looking at a mixture between online learning and one-on-one learning. So that will change as your organisation matures in this space. And then the last area is really around cascading out responsibility. So I hinted at this a little bit earlier when I spoke about everybody saw accessibility as my problem, and very quickly I decided it wasn't going to work. And what I needed to do was actually share out that responsibility. And the way that I did that initially was I wrote accessibility into the position descriptions for key roles across both across the digital organisation. So that included project managers, business analysts, designers, content writers, product owners, business analysts, front-end devs and testers. So all of them have accessibility responsibilities and accountabilities. The next iteration of that was actually writing up an inclusive, agile way of working to be really explicit about when accessibility activities needed to happen, and I accompanied that with a RACI, so with responsibilities, accountabilities, who needs to be consulted and who needs to be informed. And then the last piece to that is actually embedding in accessibility objectives into the performance management system. So I found it was really nice to have accessibility written into PDs, but most people don't read their PD after they get their job. Unless they've got a really good line manager, it's kind of forgotten. So by integrating and embedding digital accessibility outcomes into people's performance objectives, I really hope to see a change in the behaviour organisationally. So I'm sorry, I know I've rushed and I tend to go a million miles an hour. But the key things that I hope you've got out of that is I found enormous benefit in having a really strong policy, and I encourage anyone that's embarking on this to start with a really good policy. Secondly, cascade out responsibility. This needs to be something that the organisation does together. And then the third one, I haven't touched on it too much, but I do think it underpins the way that we approached accessibility, and that is have a human-centered design approach. So if you're writing a policy, why don't you engage the disability community? Why don't you talk to them about what their needs are, and have a think about your product or your organisations and your organisation and how it might be able to meet their needs. When we created our training curriculum for digital accessibility, we spoke to all the digital roles first to try and understand, how do you learn? How do you want to, start to take on more accessibility responsibility? What's the best way for us to do this so that you can actually have some credentials at the end of it? So really, always constantly engage with your user groups and constantly engage with the disability community. And if you can have team members on your team with lived experience of disability, all the better. That's really where we're looking to. And I encourage as many people as possible to really go down that path, because there's so much to be learned. And with that, I will finish up. Thank you.